Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyagola. Now, today is the last day of a historic gathering of African leaders in Russia, bringing together representatives from all 54 African countries in the Black Sea resort of Sochi. The first ever Russia-Africa summit is part of a drive by Moscow to win business and restore the influence it once had, which all but faded after the collapse in 1991 of the Soviet Union, which used to support leftist governments and movements across the continent during the Cold War. Speaking before dozens of African heads of state at the two-day summit, Russian President Vladimir Putin called for trade with African countries to double over the next 5 years and said Moscow had written off African debts to the tune of over $20 billion. In return, Western analysts believe that Russia is aiming for greater political clout on a continent with 54 United Nations member states, vast mineral wealth, and potentially lucrative markets for Russian-manufactured weapons. Here's a little flavor of what's been said at that summit.
We understand that before you, as the head of government, there are complicated tasks associated with the consequences of military, political, and socio-economic crisis. From our side, we will do everything to support your efforts to stabilize the situation in the country.
I would like to thank the government of Russia for always standing alongside Ethiopia when it was forced to defend its independence and sovereignty. We acknowledge Russia as a key partner in our development endeavors, and Ethiopia wants to further strengthen this cooperation.
Heavy weapons are necessary to create effective forces in CAR. They know the sanctions that were imposed in 2013 when there wasn't a legitimate government in the Central African Republic. They are now targeting the legitimate authorities because the armed groups get heavy weapons by circumventing the embargo, and that is why we cannot control the territory of the whole country. There, we ask for your intervention so that the embargo can be lifted.
A sampling of the discussion taking place there at that Russia-Africa summit, and we will of course hear from Nigeria's President Buhari later in the program. Well, for more on the Russia-Africa summit and Moscow's push into the continent, I'm joined now in the studio by the economist, businessman and former presidential candidate Tope Fasiwa, and by the London-based economist and international business and political analyst Christian Udechukwu. Thank you very much indeed to both of you for coming in, and I'll start with you, Christian, because you're sitting closer to me. I understand there were close to 50 African leaders attending that summit, including the heavy hitters from, Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa, Ethiopia. What's the official reason for this summit? Lots of energy discussions, mineral conversations, development stuff?
Thank you, Charles, for having me on the program. Yes, what you say is absolutely right. There were about 50 heads of governments and about 3,000 delegates that were invited from across Africa and the rest of the world to participate in the discussion. The focus of which was very wide and very broad, covering essentially infrastructure, military support and security issues, geopolitical interests, multilateral diplomatic support, and also aid, as it were. And some of the major outcomes so far has been that, for example, South Africa got deepening of security cooperation with Russia. 2 nuclear bombers touched down in South Africa symbolically just about the same time as the summit was opening. And President Putin used the opportunity to announce that these heavy hitters were in South Africa as part of some sort of joint military exercise. Nigeria got 12 attack helicopters, Mi-35 versions.
Well, of course, they're not getting them for free.
Well, yes. And also the president was also able to get interest on Ajaokuta Steel revival and some investments by Lukoil and Rosneft in Nigeria's oil and gas industries and so on. So it's been a good outing. CAR, and the DRC also got some security cooperation strengthening because the Russians are already present in those places. Rwanda and Ethiopia got nuclear programs, electricity, nuclear plants being built. And I think some sort of nuclear research excellence center is to be set up in Ethiopia and so on. So there was a $20 billion debt write-off, and then another $5 billion that was set aside as sort of trade and investment guarantees for Russian businesses looking for commercial opportunities across Africa. But I would have thought that Russia could have done more, given what was already staked out by other geopolitical power players.
Right. Nevertheless, all this is happening, and I'll bring Tope Fasiua in, all this is happening like at about the same time. Just listening to Chris, I mean, it sounds massive, all these things happening at the same time. You see what I mean? And it just sounds like Russia is preparing for this extraordinarily big push into Africa. And the question must be, why do you think, I mean, you're both a politician who was a presidential candidate and an economist, why do you think Russia is making this big push into the African continent?
Right, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Well, I mean, watching the clip just now and watching all of those events, the first thing that occurs to me is why is Africa being treated as one country, you know? And so we got all those guys, you know, Japan, of course the US or the China, calling the whole of Africa, and all of these presidents go running, you know.
Well, that's a good point, actually.
And, you know, it's a little bit demeaning. If we were talking about calling them on the platform of the AFCFTA, that could have been something different. But calling 54 African leaders to come to one country in which all of them are basically going bowl in hand.
Yeah, but to be fair, no matter how bruised your ego is,
right.
the reality is, you see what I mean? Because there's a difference between ego and reality. Okay. The reality is that they do need to go cup in hand because, I mean, their countries are in dire straits.
Cup in hand because their countries are in dire straits. Yeah. There's a lot of mismanagement over time. And I mean, when you hear things like a debt write-off, when most of the countries who had their debts written off in 2006 are back in debt now, Nigeria inclusive, you know, in unsustainable debt, no matter what they say, it's always easier to take the money. But when you have to pay back, there's a problem.
Absolutely.
I also see another trend that runs through the ongoing summit is a lot of the countries from Africa are going in for arms and ammunition.
That is true.
Y'all are going to kill yourselves a lot more. You know
that is very true. There is evidence of
we're not talking about
Russian hardware, military hardware being deployed across Africa.
We're not talking about, you know, the hardcore issues of development, standards of living, you know, great stuff that we could do. And again, for even at that, I believe that some of those real stuff like power and all that, until we begin to fix them from the ground up ourselves, all of this gallivanting, if I may call it that, are not going to help. Again, but why is this happening? Like you said, there's a bit of protectionism going on right now among the superpowers. Now, any country that calls 54 African leaders and they go running is actually positioning themselves in this chess game, right? Now, the African countries seems to be the pawns. And, you know, we've got this guy, the bishops are here, the rooks are here, the queen, the king, you know, everybody's positioning as the officers right behind, the knights are there. And so the Africans are the pawns to push them forward. Right, and you see what you can do, and you take position and use them to protect yourself. So, United States and China are playing this trade war, akin to what happened pre the Great Depression of the 1930s. One of the push, apart from the fall of the New York Stock Exchange, was actually protectionism, the beggar thy neighbor policy, they call it in economics. That happened around then when countries decided, look, we're going to protect ourselves, increase tariff and all of that. There's a kind of global implosion, and mind you, that economists have said, including the World Bank, that look, we are looking at a possibility, a very high possibility of another global recession coming next year, including the financial crisis with the banks as well. So, so if this is going on, what Russia is doing is saying, listen, we need to go pick up the pieces. Now, we're talking about Ajaokuta, which has been abandoned for ages, right? We need to go pick up the pieces of what we invested in Africa. If you went to Ethiopia, right from Bole Airport, even before you begin to go out, if you looked out of the window, you would see ladder, right? If you went there, that's one of the places you see
the
the
vehicle.
ladder car.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, the ugly, square-looking car and so on is used for taxis. And the first time I traveled through that airport and looked out of the window, I said, oh, I had to go and investigate the communist history of Ethiopia. All right, so those are the things that the Russians are moving now.
Right.
Everybody is positioning themselves for trade with Africa, and again, but my problem is they're still looking at Africa as a place to dump, as a consuming
I understand
territory
that.
and all that.
Let me bring you in, Christian Udechukwu. Is it your view, just based on what he was saying, that Russia can play an important role in Africa?
Yes, I think Russia can play a very significant role in Africa, and it is already playing a significant role. I think the main question really we should ask ourselves is Russia playing the role in Africa that Africans want Russia to play, or is Russia playing the role in Africa that it wants to play in its own interests?
Yeah, it has to be its interest first.
If we answer that question correctly, which is that presently Russia is playing to its own interests, because even Ethiopia and Rwanda that are getting nuclear power programs, I'm not sure that is the most valuable source of energy that both countries could have gone for.
But it keeps them beholden onto the Russians.
Exactly, given that they own the technology and it is very expensive to maintain, it is unsafe and all that. So for whatever duration, even if perhaps for the next 100 years, the technology for the sustainability of those power projects will come from Russia. And even the establishment of a center of excellence is not going to domesticate that capacity. So it's a problem. I would have thought, if I had an opportunity to sit around those tables with maybe the 50 heads of states, I would say, perhaps even at the African Union level, since they are now used to turning up in Russia, turning up in China, the EU and France and Japan and so on, is to say, okay, so we got these great powers now playing games, okay, so what is our game? What do we want from these people? Okay.
So they talk about it before they go in.
Yes, so what do we get out of it? I mean, we have an Africa free trade area now, so we're going to Russia next week.
Okay.
What's on our shopping list?
Absolutely, that's a good point. I'll ask you to hold your thoughts. You're watching the Arise interview, plenty more still ahead as we continue our discussion about the Russia-Africa summit and Moscow's push into the continent. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyekolu. Now, for the past 2 days, all eyes have been on the southern Russian Black Sea resort town of Sochi, where Moscow has welcomed leaders of African states in its first ever Russia-Africa summit. The slogan of the gathering is peace, security and development, and is being seen as a symbol of Russia's efforts to establish itself as a dominant global player on the African continent. But correspondents say Russia is starting from a low base. Although it has enjoyed considerable success selling arms to African countries, Moscow lags far behind competitors in trade terms. Russia says its trade with African countries rose to $20 billion last year, but it did not rank among the continent's top 5 largest partners for trade in goods, according to Eurostat. That list was topped by the European Union, followed by China, India, the United States, and the United Arab Emirates. Well, we'll talk about all that in a moment. But first, here's one of the African heavy hitters who attended that conference, Nigeria's President Buhari, speaking earlier at the summit.
There are many similarities between Russia's journey under your leadership and Nigeria's aspirations for the future. We can learn a lot from the experience of Russia's ongoing reforms of transitioning from an oil-dependent economy to a modern, diversified, and inclusive economy. Russia has, through these reforms, successfully privatized a number of state-owned entities, which have now become a global household names. This is especially so in the energy, manufacturing, defense, and the metallurgical sectors.
Nigeria's President Buhari there. And with me in the studio to talk more about that Russia-Africa summit, the economist, businessman and former presidential candidate Tope Fasiwa, and the London-based economist and international business and political analyst Christian Udechukwu. Straight away to you, Tope. Predictably, Russia's ambitions in Africa have prompted some concern in the West. That's not a surprise. Concern that Moscow is trying to outplay and outflank the West in Africa as it's doing in the Middle East. First of all, are those concerns justified? Secondly, that really hits at the point you were making earlier, that basically Africa is a playground, and they're not really interested in what the Africans think. It's like, hey, we can't let the Russians get in here.
Exactly.
We can't go back to the Cold War days.
It's really unfortunate. Like I said earlier on, it's actually the devaluation of the African, actually.
Yeah.
I think more and more, I mean, I don't know what's next. Maybe we're going to have a Mexico-African summit, or Honduras, Nicaragua, African summit, and you'd have all these guys running there because, number one, we all seem to be quite needy, and we're needy because we've mismanaged, and we're not thinking about this, about the second, third level, fifth movement in the chess game that's going on. To say at some point in time we need to actually talk to ourselves and know what exactly is going on. Now, some of these things are being precipitated by the move by China. As a matter of fact, the truth is this: like, as an economist, I kind of support a multipolar system where people kind of countries kind of pull their weights the way they can and all that. But for a while, we saw that the West had kind of neglected Africa, or sort of not taking us very serious. I was in one summit.
Particularly the United States.
I was in one summit organized by This Day in 2009 or thereabout, in This Day Dome here, and we had Tony Blair and George Bush and Condoleezza Rice, and a question was posed through Condoleezza Rice to Tony Blair that, look, what are you guys going to do about China? What's going on? And Blair said verbatim that, look, we have realized that when Africans go to China and say they want a road, the next day the Chinaman shows up with a digger. Right? But when they come to us, we give them a huge sheaf of paper. And as he was saying that, George Bush grabbed the mic and went on another angle about, China is actually polluting Africa and so on. And, so they left the space for China. And then you see that what Chinese guys are doing, they're kind of buying assets. I heard they even took over some free zone in Lagos and stuff for 45 years concession. They took over something in Djibouti as well. They're taking things over. And not only that, they're pouring a lot of their people into Africa. Right, because they've got 1.4 billion people they need to manage, excess labor and all of that, push them to Africa. So now they're seeing that the Chinese are making this move, and I think that's the reason why the West is now saying, look, we can't sit by the side. And of course, the Chinese and the Russians used to have some sort of alliance in the ideological world.
Now economically they're going there.
Exactly. Now, mind the fact that, look, ideologies don't work anymore. What really works is pragmatism. Whatever it is you can get. The Chinese are now more capitalist than the Americans. The Americans and the Europeans are a lot more socialist than Russia. You know what I'm saying?
And let me just bring you in.
For you that you have to go for.
Sure, let me bring you in, Chris. And talking about pragmatism, Vladimir Putin, looking at this from a political point of view, Vladimir Putin is being called a geopolitical master. Having now established himself in the Middle East, he's moving into Africa and all that. Has he earned that title, do you think?
Well, I think he has done a lot more to earn that. He's proven himself to be a more stable political player, leveraging on the levers of power and influence that it gives him to even stabilize and threaten the other geopolitical centers when it fits and suits him. In the EU, for example, he supplies 60% of the energy needs to the EU's largest economy, Germany.
Absolutely.
And he has a former German chancellor running the company. So, and the economy of the EU, despite Western hostility, is so integrated to that of Russia now that it is very clear. In fact, I remember Barack Obama in the heat of the Ukraine crisis flying into Brussels to tell them that they can't really go toe-to-toe to Russia. That there's no war, no conflict with Russia. They would only go through the route of sanctions and try and see how they can pressure the Russians to come on side. So it is very clear who holds the levers and the balance of power when it comes to Russia-EU relations.
Right, but also in the Middle East.
When you go to the Middle East, yes, again, now they've altered
the Americans
absolutely,
out.
They've altered the game because all the alliances between Turkey and Saudi Arabia and all the others who wanted to topple Assad, and those who banded with Qatar and the Egyptians to try and also create some space for themselves in Egypt, in Syria, when the Americans also moved in some boots on the ground, and the Russians came in and said, hang on. We are here on formal invitation. We've got our men over there, so don't drop a bomb on that side. Anything happens, we'll come after you.
But of course, they have greater strategic interests in the Middle East. I mean, let's just talk, because I haven't got that much time left. Is it your sense, though, that Russia is really engaging with Africa, or just tinkering with Africa, exploring or testing the waters and merely going after the optics?
For me, it really doesn't matter what Russia is looking out for in Africa. I think what matters is what the Africans, what these 50 heads of states who went to Russia were interested in getting out of Russia, given their now access
So what do you think they were interested in getting?
It didn't seem to me like they went with a lot of shopping lists, because what I would have, if you look at the sequence of some of the meetings that the Russian president had with African heads of state, if you look at the meeting table, you'll find that the Russian sides look a little bit more prepared than the other side, because you had everybody on the Russian table sitting with a large...
I think they all wanted to go on holiday at Sochi.
Well, it seems like it, because, when you look at even the Russian president, when he sat on his table, there was a small, large sheet of paper, pile of folder that was there. So if you talk about trade, there's, depending on the country he's talking to, he can go to the trade and look at whatever the issues are, whether you're talking about granules or butter and so on. So I think that to the extent that Africa has not really defined its expected strategic outcomes from engagement with China, Russia, France, EU, the United States, and India, and Japan, and all these big budgets that they have, to the extent that there's no, this is what we want, the major powers who come will always say, this is what we...
Right, they'll always take advantage.
They'll always take advantage.
Okay, we've got like 40 seconds left, Tope. I apologize for that.
No problem.
Is it fair to say that at the very least, Russia's reach is slowly extending across Africa?
Well, let's say that good for them. If it does, really, they need to move fast. They know. They know they need to move fast because everybody's repositioning. If Brexit actually does work at the end of the day, if Britain is going to make its move, the European Union already has EPA on the table.
Well, they've got a British Africa summit.
So
next year.
They have the EPA on the table.
Right.
But I think one thing is fundamental. Africa is not one country, right? And the needs are different. CAR is there begging for ammunition.
Yeah.
Right. So what's South Africa begging
so
for?
is Nigeria. It's
are we
fighting a war
supposed to
in the
even
north.
be begging for stuff all over the place? And if we're looking for loans, what did we do with what we had before? Until the day the African countries individually realize that they need to step up their game and step up their humanity of their people. Until that day, all of this junketing is not really going to work.
Okay, Tope Fasiwa, the economist, businessman, former presidential candidate, and Christian Udechukwu, London-based economist, international business and political analyst. Thank you very much indeed. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again for a fresh edition tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja and London, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.